When the massive mountain man they called the Beast of Montana collapsed under burning timber, everyone assumed Gideon Vale would die alone, exactly how he'd lived. But Clara Whitmore, the too large woman the world had thrown away, charged into flames that would have stopped any man. What happened next on that mountain ridge became the most legendary love story the frontier had ever seen. Before we begin, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Now let me take you back to 1872. The first bride lasted 4 days. Gideon Vale still remembered the exact moment Margaret Henderson saw his face for the first time. Really saw it, not just the quick glance at the stagecoach station where politeness kept her eyes controlled. It happened on the second morning, when early light came through the cabin window and caught the scarred left side of his face, the tissue that pulled his mouth into something between a grimace and a snarl, even when he meant to smile. She'd gasped, actually gasped like he'd struck her. "I'm sorry," she'd whispered, backing toward the door. "I thought the letters made you sound... I just can't." "Can't what?" he'd wanted to ask. "Can't look at me? Can't imagine waking up next to this face for the rest of your life? Can't pretend I'm human enough to love?" But Gideon had said nothing. He'd learned early that his voice, deep enough to rattle windows, rough as granite scraping granite, only made things worse. So he'd stood there, all 6'7" of him, shoulders broad enough to block doorways, hands that could snap axe handles, and watched her flee like he was the monster every mirror suggested he might be. The second bride made it almost a week. Catherine Morris had arrived with trunks full of silk dresses completely unsuitable for mountain life, a collection of romance novels, and what Gideon later recognized as desperate determination. She tried. He had to give her that. She attempted to cook on the wood stove, burned everything she touched, and cried quietly when she thought he couldn't hear. But it wasn't the isolation that broke her, or even his appearance. It was his silence. "Say something!" she'd finally screamed on the 6th day, hurling a tin plate across the cabin. "Anything! I've been here nearly a week and you've spoken maybe 30 words total. I can't live with a man who won't even talk to me." What she didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that Gideon had forgotten how to make conversation. 16 years on this mountain, with only occasional supply runs to town where shopkeepers served him quickly and avoided eye contact, had stripped away whatever social polish he'd once possessed. His father had died when Gideon was 19, leaving him this land and not much else. His mother had passed 2 years before that, and his younger sister had married a banker from St. Louis and never looked back. Couldn't blame her. Who'd want to remember a brother who looked like something that crawled out of a mining accident? The scar came from a grizzly bear when Gideon was 23. The bear had taken most of the left side of his face, torn muscle and tissue in ways that even the traveling doctor said shouldn't have been survivable. "You're lucky to be breathing," the doc had told him, needle and thread working while Gideon bit down on leather. Unlucky in just about every other way, though. Unlucky. That word had followed him ever since. The third bride never even made it to the cabin. Emily Ross took one look at the narrow mountain trail, the sheer drop on one side, the dense forest pressing in on the other, and the massive silent man expecting her to climb onto his horse, and she'd turned right around. "I'll wait for the next stagecoach," she'd announced. "I don't care if it takes a week." Gideon had ridden back to his mountain alone, leading the pack horse that carried supplies and nothing else. Bride number 4, Sarah Chen, daughter of a railroad worker, 26 and practical as hammered iron, lasted almost 3 weeks. Long enough that Gideon started to hope. She didn't flinch at his face, didn't seem bothered by the silence, worked alongside him repairing fence posts and cutting timber for winter. Then the first real cold snap hit in October. Gideon woke one morning to find her note weighted down by the coffee pot. "Gone to town. Don't follow. The isolation would kill me before winter ends. I'm sorry." He'd sat at that table for 2 hours staring at her handwriting, before finally crumpling the paper and throwing it into the stove. The fifth bride broke something in him that the others hadn't quite managed. Rachel Thornton arrived in late spring, a widow from Ohio with sad eyes and a quiet dignity that made Gideon think maybe, just maybe, she understood loneliness the way he did. She was 42, old enough that vanity had been beaten out of her by life, practical enough to appreciate what he offered: land, shelter, protection, stability. They'd worked well together for almost 2 months. She'd established a garden, organized his chaotic supplies, even laughed once when he'd accidentally knocked over an entire shelf trying to reach something on the top. "You're like a bear in a dollhouse," she'd said, and it wasn't cruel, just observational. Gideon had started to relax, started to think about expansion, maybe children, definitely a larger house, started to imagine a future that wasn't just endless solitary survival. Then her sister wrote. Rachel's younger sister, recently widowed herself, needed help, needed family, needed Rachel to come back to Ohio and help run the boarding house their parents had left behind. "I have to go," Rachel told him on a Tuesday morning, already packing. "Family is... I can't just abandon her, Gideon. You understand, don't you?" He'd understood. Understanding didn't make it hurt less. "Will you come back?" he'd asked, hating how the question made him sound. Desperate, pathetic. Rachel had looked at him with something that might have been pity. "I don't think so. This life, it's not for me. I tried to make it work, I really did. But I wake up every morning and the silence is so heavy I can barely breathe. The mountain presses down on everything. I feel like I'm being erased bit by bit until there'll be nothing left of who I was." She'd left on Thursday. Gideon spent the next 6 months alone, and the silence that had driven Rachel away became his only companion. He stopped going to town except when absolutely necessary. Stopped checking the mail. Stopped hoping. The mountain didn't care if he was lonely. The mountain didn't care if he was ugly or silent or good or bad. The mountain just was, ancient and indifferent, and Gideon found a strange comfort in that indifference. Trees didn't flinch. Rivers didn't gasp. The wind didn't whisper behind his back. He settled into a routine that would have killed most men through sheer monotony. Up before dawn, check the animals, cut wood, repair whatever needed repairing, fences, roof, his own damaged soul. Hunt, fish, preserve food for winter, sleep, repeat. The loneliness became physical after a while, an actual ache in his chest that he couldn't rub away. Sometimes he'd catch himself talking out loud just to hear a human voice, even if it was just his own rough growl discussing weather patterns with absolutely nobody. He was 41 years old. Not ancient, but not young either. Old enough to know that whatever dreams he'd once harbored about family, about love, about someone choosing to stay, were as dead as the pine trees killed by bark beetles on the North Ridge. The mountain would be the only thing that stayed loyal to him. Then, on a bitter spring morning when snow still clung to shadows and the wind cut like broken glass, Gideon made his quarterly supply run to town. He'd been avoiding these trips, stretching them longer and longer, but he'd run completely out of salt and flour, and a man could only eat fresh game for so long before his body started craving bread. The town, barely worthy of the name, just a collection of buildings clustered where two trading routes intersected, treated him the way it always did. Shopkeepers served him quickly. Mothers pulled children aside when he passed. Men nodded curtly and found reasons to be elsewhere. He'd loaded his supplies and was preparing to leave when the postmaster, old Henry Briggs, called out from his doorway. "Vale, got something for you." Gideon almost didn't stop. Mail meant nothing good. Bills, maybe. Notices about taxes. Definitely not letters from anyone who cared whether he lived or died. But Henry was already shuffling toward him, waving an envelope, and refusing would draw more attention than accepting. "Came in on yesterday's coach," Henry said, studying Gideon with the frank curiosity of someone too old to bother with politeness. "From Iowa. Another bride inquiry, looks like." The words hit Gideon like a physical blow. "Not interested." "Didn't say you were. Just doing my job." Henry thrust the envelope forward. "Woman named Whitmore. Wrote directly to me first, asking about you. Wanted to know if you were still... What did she say? Accepting correspondence regarding matrimonial arrangements. Told her you'd stopped checking the matrimonial listings months ago, but if she wanted to write directly, I'd make sure you got it." "Why would you do that?" Gideon's voice came out harsher than intended. Henry shrugged. "Because she sounded different, and because I remember your father. Good man. Would have wanted his son to have more than mountains and loneliness." Gideon took the letter because refusing felt like more effort than accepting. He shoved it into his coat pocket and rode back to his mountain, the envelope burning against his ribs like a hot coal the entire way. He ignored it for 3 days. The letter sat on his table, unopened, taunting him with possibilities he'd already murdered. Every time he walked past, he told himself to burn it. Every time he didn't. On the fourth morning, curiosity won over self-preservation. He opened the envelope. The handwriting was bold, clear, unapologetic, not the careful feminine script of previous correspondence designed to prove education and refinement. This looked like someone wrote the way they lived, directly, without ornament. Mr. Vale, I'm going to be honest because lies waste everyone's time, and I don't have patience for wasted time. My name is Clara Whitmore. I'm 37 years old. I'm not delicate, not beautiful, not soft-spoken, and not what anyone would call traditionally desirable. I'm what polite people call sturdy and what honest people call too damn big. I'm loud when something needs saying. I take up space and stopped apologizing for it about 10 years ago. I've worked as a cook, a farmhand, a washerwoman, and a dozen other jobs that break most people's backs. I can work all day without complaint. I can handle livestock, preserve food, manage a household, and I'm told I make the best venison stew in 3 counties. I've never been married. Men tend to prefer women who make them feel larger by being smaller. I have the opposite effect. I'm writing to you because Henry Briggs mentioned you're a man who values honesty over pretense, work over conversation, and solitude over society. He said you've been disappointed by women who wanted something you couldn't be. I'm not interested in changing anyone. I'm interested in partnership with someone who won't try to change me either. I'm not running from anything except a life where I have to pretend to be less than I am just to make others comfortable. I'm running toward the possibility of a place where being exactly who I am might actually be useful. Henry said your mountain is brutal, your cabin is isolated, and you're not much for talking. None of that frightens me. What frightens me is wasting whatever years I have left trying to fit into spaces too small to hold me. Perhaps 2 people the world rejected might survive better together. If that sounds sensible to you, write back. If not, I won't take offense. I'm used to not being wanted. Yours in brutal honesty, Clara Whitmore Gideon read the letter 3 times. Then he sat down, pulled out paper he hadn't touched since Rachel left, and wrote 2 words, "Come north." He added his address, sealed the envelope, and rode back to town that same day to post it before courage failed him. The response came faster than he'd expected. Clara wrote that she'd arrive on the first Thursday in May, weather permitting, on the northbound stagecoach. She asked for nothing except clear directions from the station to his property. "I can ride," she wrote. "I can walk. I can manage. Just tell me where to go." Gideon spent 3 weeks preparing for her arrival like a man preparing for siege. He repaired everything that could be repaired. He cleaned the cabin more thoroughly than it had been cleaned in years. He built a second bed frame just in case, because assuming anything felt dangerous. He also spent those weeks arguing with himself. This was a mistake. She'd arrive, take one look at him, and the brutal honesty would evaporate under the reality of his face, his size, his damaged voice, his terminal inability to maintain conversation. But another part of him, the part that had stayed stubbornly alive through 16 years of isolation, whispered that maybe, just maybe, someone who described herself as too damn big might understand what it felt like to be too damn much for the world to accommodate. The Thursday she was supposed to arrive, Gideon rode down to the stagecoach station 2 hours early. He waited, standing apart from the small crowd, aware of the space people maintained around him. The coach arrived on time, horses steaming in the cool spring air. 3 passengers disembarked. An older man in a suit. A young couple, newlyweds by the look of them. And Clara Whitmore. She stepped down from the coach without assistance, moving with the solid confidence of someone who'd long ago stopped waiting for help that wouldn't come. She was tall, maybe 5'10", which was unusual for a woman, and built like someone who'd spent decades doing physical labor. Broad shoulders, strong arms, a body that was all function, zero apology. She wore a practical traveling dress in dark blue, sturdy boots, and a hat that looked like it had survived several years of hard use. Her face was round, weathered by sun and wind, with sharp blue eyes that swept the station with frank assessment. Those eyes found Gideon. Most women's eyes would slide away, or widen, or fill with poorly disguised horror. Clara's eyes narrowed slightly, studying him with the same practical assessment she'd given everything else. She looked at his face, scar and all, the way someone might examine difficult land before deciding how to build on it. Then she walked directly toward him. "Gideon Vale?" Her voice matched her handwriting, clear, direct, no nonsense. "Yes, Clara Whitmore." She didn't extend her hand for a delicate shake. She stuck it out like she expected a real greeting. You're bigger than I expected. That'll be useful for heavy work. Gideon shook her hand. Her grip was firm, calloused, the handshake of someone who'd spent years proving they could work as hard as any man. You brought much? He asked, nodding toward the coach. One trunk, one bag. Anything I can't carry isn't worth keeping. The trunk, when he lifted it, weighed enough to confirm she wasn't exaggerating about her cooking supplies. He loaded it onto the pack horse, while Clara secured her bag to the saddle of the horse he'd brought for her. Long ride? She asked. 3 hours. Steep in places. Then we should get started. She mounted with practiced ease, settling into the saddle like someone who'd spent considerable time on horseback. Lead the way. The ride began in silence, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence that had existed with previous brides. This felt more like the silence of two people conserving energy for the work ahead. After about an hour, Clara spoke. Henry said 5 women left before me. Gideon tensed. Yes. What was wrong with you that they couldn't handle? The bluntness should have offended him. Instead, it felt almost refreshing. I'm ugly, he said flatly. I don't talk much. The isolation drives people crazy. Henry mentioned the bear attack. He talks too much. He cares. There's worse sins. Clara looked around at the forest pressing in on both sides of the trail. This is beautiful. That caught him off guard. Most people call it oppressive. Most people are idiots who can't appreciate things that aren't domesticated and prettied up for their comfort. She gestured at the dense pine forest. This is real. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not. I like that. They rode in silence for another hour before Clara spoke again. The scar doesn't bother me. Give it time. No, I mean, it genuinely doesn't register as something negative. She glanced at him. I had a nephew with a port wine birthmark covering half his face. Beautiful kid, brilliant mind, died of fever at 13. Taught me early that faces are just faces. What matters is what's behind them. Gideon didn't know how to respond to that, so he said nothing. When they finally reached the cabin, solid logs, simple construction, perched on a ridge with views of the valley below, Clara dismounted and stood for a long moment, just looking. It's perfect, she finally said. It's basic. Perfect doesn't mean fancy. Perfect means appropriate for purpose. She turned in a slow circle, taking in the outbuildings, the cleared land, the forest pressing close. You built all this yourself? Mostly. My father started it. I finished. Good bones, she said, which might have been about the cabin, or might have been about something else entirely. Inside, Clara walked through the space with the same practical assessment. She opened the cupboard, examined his supplies, checked the stove, looked at the simple furniture. When's the last time you ate something that wasn't meat and potatoes? Can't remember. That explains the haunted look. She started unpacking her trunk without asking permission. I'll make dinner. You have somewhere else to be. This is my cabin. Then sit down and stay out of my way. For the next 2 hours, Gideon watched Clara transform his kitchen. She worked with the efficient violence of someone who'd cooked in difficult conditions before, reorganizing his supplies, criticizing his storage methods, muttering about how men always neglected the most obvious improvements. You have space for a root cellar under here, she said at one point, stomping on the floorboards. Why haven't you dug it out? Never seemed necessary. Everything seems unnecessary until you need it. We'll dig it out next week. We. She'd said we like it was already decided. The stew she made, from dried beef, wild onions, preserved vegetables from her own supplies, and herbs Gideon couldn't identify, was the best thing he'd eaten in 16 years. Maybe longer. This is, he started. Don't tell me it's good. I know it's good. Tell me if there's anything you can't eat or don't like. No, I'll eat anything. Everyone says that until you serve them organ meat or blood sausage. She ladled out generous portions. Eat. You look half-starved despite your size. They ate in silence. Clara finished her bowl, immediately served herself more, and didn't apologize for her appetite. Afterward, she stood and stretched. I'll take the second bed. I built it for me. I know. That was considerate. She met his eyes directly. I appreciate you not assuming anything. We'll figure out whatever this is at whatever pace makes sense. That agreeable? Yes. Good. I'm exhausted. Tomorrow I'll start earning my keep. She disappeared into the second room, barely more than a closet with a bed, and shut the door. Gideon sat at his table for a long time, staring at the empty stew pot, trying to remember the last time his cabin had felt this alive. For the first time in months, hope crept back into his chest like an unwelcome guest he couldn't quite bring himself to throw out. Clara woke before dawn, which didn't surprise Gideon since he'd been awake for an hour already, trying to be quiet and failing because everything he did sounded like a landslide in the confined space. She emerged from her room fully dressed, hair already pinned back, ready to work. "Coffee?" he offered. "Is it as terrible as your cooking?" "Probably." "Then yes, I'll take some." She accepted the tin cup he handed her, took one sip, and made a face. "This tastes like you boiled dirt." "It's coffee." "It's an insult to coffee beans everywhere." She dumped it out the window. "I'll handle coffee from now on. Show me what needs doing today." The first week established a rhythm that felt almost dangerously comfortable. Clara worked beside him without complaint, splitting wood in the morning, hauling water from the creek, checking fence lines on the eastern pasture where he kept 4 horses and a handful of cattle. She didn't work like someone trying to prove something. She worked like someone who knew her own capability and saw no point in false modesty about it. "You're stronger than most men I've worked with," Gideon observed on the third day. Watching her lift a fence post he'd assumed would require both of them. "Most men have never had to be strong enough to compensate for being unwanted," Clara said, driving the post into the hole she'd dug. "You learn early that nobody's going to help you, so you better be able to help yourself." She didn't say it with self-pity, just fact. They fell into a pattern of communication that worked for both of them, sparse, direct, functional. Clara would point out things that needed improvement, and Gideon would either agree or explain why he'd done it differently. They argued occasionally, brief, sharp exchanges that resolved quickly because neither of them had patience for prolonged conflict. "This shed is positioned wrong," Clara announced on the 5th day. "Weather comes from the northwest. You've got the door facing directly into the wind. Shed's been there 15 years. And it's been wrong for 15 years. Doesn't mean we can't fix it. Moving a shed is a week's work. Then it's a good thing I'm not afraid of work." She grabbed a shovel. "We'll start digging the foundation for the new position tomorrow." Gideon opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. She was right. The shed was positioned poorly. He'd known it for years and done nothing because moving it alone seemed insurmountable, and he'd gotten used to problems being insurmountable. "Fine," he said. Clara looked genuinely surprised. "Just like that?" "You're right. Arguing with right wastes time." Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but close. "I think we'll manage just fine, Gideon Vale." The nights were harder than the days, not because of tension between them, but because of the strange intimacy of sharing space after so long alone. Clara read in the evenings books she'd brought with her, practical volumes about farming, animal husbandry, food preservation. Sometimes she'd read passages aloud without asking if he wanted to hear them. "Listen to this," she'd say, and then launch into a paragraph about crop rotation or soil composition, and Gideon would listen because her voice made the cabin feel less empty. One evening, about 10 days after her arrival, Clara set down her book and looked at him directly. "Why did you agree to mail-order brides in the first place?" The question caught him off guard. Seemed like the only option. "For what?" "Not dying alone, I suppose." "Everyone dies alone," Clara said. "Even people surrounded by family die alone in the end. That's not what you were really after." Gideon took his time answering. "My father used to say a man needs something to work for beyond himself. The mountain's beautiful, but it doesn't care if I'm here or not. Thought maybe having someone who did care might make the work mean something." Clara nodded slowly. "That's honest. More honest than most people manage." She paused. "The women who left, did they give you real reasons or polite ones?" "What's the difference?" "Polite reasons are about not hurting feelings. Real reasons are about truth." She leaned back in her chair. "Margaret said it was the isolation, but really, she couldn't handle looking at your face every day. Catherine said it was your silence, but really she needed a man who'd make her feel delicate by comparison. Sarah said it was the cold, but really she needed entertainment you couldn't provide. Rachel said it was family obligation, but really she was terrified of disappearing into a life this small." Gideon stared at her. "How do you know all that?" Because I'm not stupid, and women always tell other women the truth, even when they lie to men. Clara met his eyes. Henry's wife wrote to me, told me everything, thought I should know what I was walking into. The betrayal stung. And you came anyway. Of course I came anyway. Their reasons for leaving told me more about them than about you. She stood, walked to the window, looked out at darkness broken only by starlight. You want to know what I see when I look at you, Gideon? He wasn't sure he did, but he nodded anyway. I see a man who survived something that should have killed him. I see someone who built a life in a place that would break most people. I see capability, endurance, and a kind of stubborn resilience that refuses to quit even when quitting would be easier. She turned back to face him. The scar just tells me you've been tested. What matters is that you're still standing. Something in Gideon's chest cracked open, some calcified shell he'd built around hope. The other women, he started. The other women wanted a fantasy, Clara interrupted. A handsome mountain man who'd be rough around the edges but fundamentally safe. Someone wild enough to be interesting but tame enough to be comfortable. They wanted the idea of frontier life without the reality of it. She walked back to the table, sat down. I don't want fantasies. I want real. This, she gestured around the cabin, is real. You're real. That's enough. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that didn't need filling. Finally, Clara spoke again. I'm going to say something, and you're not going to argue with me. All right? We're going to expand this cabin, add a proper kitchen with more counter space, build a real pantry, maybe another room for... She stopped. For whatever we might need eventually, and we're digging that root cellar. That's a summer's worth of work. Good. I like staying busy. She stood. I'm going to bed. Tomorrow, we start on the shed. She disappeared into her room, leaving Gideon alone with his thoughts and the strange, unfamiliar feeling that his life might actually be expanding rather than contracting. The shed took 9 days to move. They worked dawn to dusk, dismantling it piece by piece, preparing the new foundation, reassembling it in the better location. Clara worked with relentless efficiency, but she also sang while she worked, old songs Gideon half remembered from childhood, mining ballads and folk tunes that echoed across the ridge. You have a good voice, he said on the 7th day. It's serviceable, Clara replied, hammering a nail. My mother sang, said it made hard work easier if you gave it a rhythm. She's still alive? No. Fever took her when I was 19. Father followed 6 months later. Think he just didn't want to keep going without her. Clara paused, hammer suspended. They had something rare, real partnership, not just two people occupying the same space, but two people actually building something together. That what you want? That's what I'm here to find out. By the end of the 2nd week, the shed stood in its new location, properly positioned, significantly more weatherproof than before. Clara surveyed their work with satisfaction. See? Told you we could do it. Never doubted you. Liar. You doubted constantly. I could see it in your face every time I suggested something. But she was almost smiling. You're learning, though. News of Clara's presence spread faster than Gideon anticipated. The first visitor arrived 3 weeks after she did, Tom Bradley, a farmer from the lower valley who'd occasionally traded with Gideon for timber. Heard you had a new bride, Tom said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. His eyes found Clara, widened slightly, then carefully neutralized. Wanted to welcome her to the territory. Clara emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Clara Whitmore, you need something, or is this purely social? Tom blinked at the directness. Social, I suppose. My wife Martha sent preserves as a welcoming gift. That's kind of her. Clara accepted the jar Tom thrust forward. Tell her I'll return the jar with something inside. I don't believe in keeping containers. After Tom left, Clara examined the preserves with a critical eye. Strawberry, pectin ratio is off. It'll be runny, but the thought counts. He seemed surprised by you, Gideon observed. Most people are. Clara set the jar in the cupboard. They expect someone different, someone who fits their idea of what a woman should look like, sound like, be like. Then they meet me and have to recalibrate. Does that bother you? Used to. Now I just find it tiresome. She started preparing dinner, venison stew again, but with wild mushrooms she'd found that morning. People waste so much energy on appearances. Who's pretty, who's acceptable, who fits. Meanwhile, the real work of living goes undone. More visitors came over the following weeks. Some genuinely friendly, offering welcome. Others transparently curious, wanting to see the unusual couple for themselves. Gideon watched Clara handle each visitor with the same practical directness, never apologizing for herself, never pretending to be smaller or quieter or different than she was. Martha Bradley, Tom's wife, came herself eventually, a round woman with kind eyes and a tendency to nervous chattering. "Oh my, this is quite the place," she said, looking around the cabin. "So isolated. Don't you find it lonely?" "No," Clara said simply. "I find it peaceful." "But don't you miss society? Dances, church socials, quilting circles?" "I miss useful work accomplished by competent people," Clara replied. "If that happens at quilting circles, I haven't seen it." Martha laughed, surprised into honesty. "Fair point. Most of those gatherings are just excuses for gossip." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "They're all talking about you two, you know." "Let them talk," Clara said. "Talking keeps them occupied and out of our way." But Martha's words proved prophetic. The gossip spread through the territory like fog through valleys. The giant mountain brute and his oversized bride. Two people nobody else wanted, hiding in the mountains because civilization had no use for either of them. The whispers reached Gideon's ears during his next supply run to town. He was loading flour onto his pack horse when he heard two men talking near the mercantile. "Heard she's bigger than some men." "Figures? What normal woman would want to live up there with that scarred bastard?" Two freaks finding each other. Almost poetic. Gideon's hand stilled on the flour sack. The old instinct rose. Confront them, defend Clara, maybe break one of their jaws in the process. But he'd learned years ago that violence only confirmed what people already believed about him. He finished loading in silence and rode home. Clara took one look at his face when he arrived and knew. What did they say? "Doesn't matter. It matters if it's bothering you." She crossed her arms. "Tell me." So he did, hating every word, watching for her reaction. Clara listened without expression. When he finished, she nodded once. "Well, they're not entirely wrong. We are two people the world didn't want. That's just fact." She started unloading supplies. "The question is whether we let that define us or whether we define it ourselves." "How do you mean?" "They think we're hiding up here because we failed at fitting in down there." Clara hefted a flour sack like it weighed nothing. "But what if we're not hiding? What if we're building something they're too small-minded to understand?" "Building what?" "A life that works for us instead of working for their approval." She looked at him directly. "I didn't come here to prove anything to anyone but myself. The question is, did you bring me here for yourself or for them?" The question cut deeper than she probably intended. "For myself," Gideon said quietly, "but I won't pretend their words don't sting." "Of course they sting. We're human, not stone." Clara set down the flour. "But here's what I learned a long time ago. People who've never done anything difficult love to criticize people who do difficult things every day. It makes them feel superior without requiring any actual effort on their part." She walked to the window, looked out at the mountain vista. "This place is hard. The work is brutal. The isolation is real. But I wake up every morning and choose this life because it's mine, not some version of life shaped by people who think I should be quieter, smaller, more palatable." She turned back. "The mountain doesn't care what I look like or sound like. It only cares what I can do." That's honest in a way society never was. Gideon absorbed this, feeling something shift in his understanding. "You're not bothered by what they say about you?" "Oh, I'm bothered, but being bothered and being stopped are different things." Clara moved back to the supplies. "They can talk all they want. Meanwhile, we'll keep building, and when winter comes and they're struggling, we'll see who's actually capable and who just talks a good game." Her confidence proved warranted sooner than either expected. June arrived with unseasonable cold and late snows that damaged early crops across the valley. Gideon and Clara, who'd spent weeks preparing cold frames and covered beds, lost nothing. When Tom Bradley showed up asking if they had spare seed potatoes because his entire planting had frozen, Clara sold them to him at fair price. "You saved enough?" Tom asked, surprised by her generosity. "We prepared for disaster," Clara said. "That's what competent people do." More requests came. Seeds, preserved food, advice on protecting livestock from late frost. Clara handled each with the same practical generosity, helping where she could, charging fair prices where she couldn't afford to be charitable. "You're making friends," Gideon observed after the fifth visitor in as many days. "I'm building credit," Clara corrected. "Friendship is what happens when credit accumulates enough that people forget it started as transaction." By July, they'd begun work on the cabin expansion. Clara designed it herself, sketching plans that maximized function while minimizing wasted space. Gideon contributed his knowledge of construction, and together they created something neither could have built alone. They worked side by side every day, and slowly, so slowly Gideon almost didn't notice it happening, the space between them began to close. It started with small things. Clara's hand on his shoulder when she needed to reach past him. Gideon steadying her when she climbed to roof height. Shared jokes about their combined inability to cook anything that wasn't stew. The way Clara started saying, "our cabin," instead of "the cabin." One evening in late July, Gideon was splitting wood for the winter stores when he miscalculated a swing and drove the axe into his boot instead of the log. The blade bit through leather and into his foot, not deep, but enough to bleed heavily. "Damn it," he growled, dropping onto a stump. Clara appeared instantly, somehow having seen or heard from inside. She knelt, examined the wound with hands that were gentle despite their size and strength. "Not too deep, clean cut. You'll live." She helped him inside, sat him at the table, and retrieved her medical kit. "This is going to hurt." "I know." She cleaned the wound with whiskey, stitched it closed with the same efficiency she brought to everything, and wrapped it in clean cloth. "You should rest that for a few days," she said. "No heavy work." "Can't afford to rest. We're behind on—" "We're not behind on anything that can't wait." Clara's voice was firm. "I can handle the daily work. You'll handle not being an idiot and making this worse." He wanted to argue, but the look in her eyes stopped him. For 3 days, Gideon watched Clara do his work and hers without complaint. She hauled water, fed animals, continued work on the cabin expansion, and still managed to prepare meals that made his previous attempts at cooking seem like crimes against food. On the third evening, he found her sitting on the porch, shoulders slumped, exhaustion written in every line of her body. "You all right?" he asked. "Fine, just tired." "You're doing too much." "I'm doing what needs doing." She didn't look at him. That's what partnership means. When one person can't carry their weight, the other picks up the slack. Eventually it balances out. "It's more than that, though," Gideon said quietly. "You could have let things slide. Nobody would have blamed you. I would have blamed me." Clara finally turned to look at him. "This life works because we both refuse to quit when things get hard. The moment either of us starts making excuses is the moment this whole thing falls apart." Something in her voice made Gideon look closer. "What happened to you, Clara? Before you came here?" She was quiet for a long time. Then, slowly, she began to speak. "I was engaged once, 23 years old. His name was Robert. Good man, or so I thought. Owned a mill. We planned a life together." She stared out at the darkening valley. 2 weeks before the wedding, his mother sat me down, told me Robert had expressed concerns about my size, about how I'd look at his side during church services, about whether our children might inherit my proportions. Gideon felt anger rising in his chest, but he stayed quiet. His mother suggested I might consider eating less, becoming more refined. She actually used that word, refined, like I was raw ore that needed processing. Clara's hands clenched in her lap. Robert stood there and said nothing, didn't defend me, didn't tell his mother to leave, just stood there looking embarrassed that I existed. "What did you do?" "I left. Walked out of that house and never went back." Clara's voice was hard. "Spent the next 14 years working myself to bone, proving I didn't need anyone, proving I was worth more than their approval. But somewhere along the way, I realized I was still letting them define me, still trying to prove something to people whose opinions shouldn't matter." She turned to face Gideon directly. "That's why I wrote to you, because I was tired of proving, tired of fighting to justify my existence to people who'd already decided I wasn't worth the effort. I wanted to find someone who saw capability instead of deficit, function instead of appearance." "And did you?" Gideon asked. "Find that?" Clara smiled, not the almost smile she usually gave, but a real one. "I'm still figuring that out, but so far, yeah, I think maybe I did. They sat together in the gathering darkness, and Gideon felt something shift between them. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a quiet settling, like pieces finding their proper places. The next morning, his foot was healed enough to walk, and they returned to working side by side. But something had changed. Clara started touching him more casually, a hand on his arm, fingers brushing his when they passed tools, her shoulder bumping his when they worked close together. And Gideon, who'd been alone for so long he'd forgotten what casual affection felt like, found himself responding, standing closer than strictly necessary, finding excuses to help her with tasks she could easily handle alone. Noticing things about her he'd been too careful to notice before, the way she hummed while cooking, the strength in her arms when she lifted heavy loads, the sharp intelligence in her eyes when she solved problems. One evening in August, Clara looked up from the book she was reading and said, "I think we should combine the bedrooms." Gideon nearly dropped the harness he'd been mending. "What?" "We're building 2 new rooms anyway. Seems wasteful to maintain 2 bedrooms when we could have 1 bedroom and a proper storage room." She met his eyes steadily. "Unless you'd prefer to keep things as they are." "No," Gideon said, probably too quickly. "I mean, if that's what you want." "It is." Clara set down her book. "But I need you to understand something. I'm not delicate. I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not, even in private. If this is going to work, it works with complete honesty, or it doesn't work at all. I don't want you to be different than you are," Gideon said. He struggled for words. "You're the first person who's ever made me feel like being exactly who I am might be enough." Clara stood, walked to where he sat, and kissed him. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was firm, direct, honest, exactly like everything else about her. When she pulled back, she was smiling. "Good. Then we understand each other." That night, Clara moved her belongings into Gideon's room, and the cabin that had echoed with loneliness for 16 years finally felt like a home. The work continued through August and into September. They finished the cabin expansion, adding a real kitchen, a storage room, and a bedroom large enough for 2 people who both took up considerable space. They dug the root cellar, lined it with stone, and filled it with preserved food for winter. And slowly, word spread through the valley that the unusual couple on the mountain ridge were managing better than most families with twice the resources and half the challenges. When Tom Bradley came to trade for winter timber, he found Clara directing construction on a new barn, while Gideon cut logs with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing it his entire life. "You 2 are building an empire up here," Tom said, genuine admiration in his voice. "We're building a life," Clara corrected. "Empire suggests we care about impressing people. We don't." But they had impressed people, whether they cared to or not. The mockery that had followed Clara's arrival had quieted, replaced by grudging respect. The couple everyone had written off as rejects hiding from the world had proven more capable than those who'd rejected them. Late September brought the first real signs of approaching winter. Morning frost lingered past sunrise. The wind carried ice from the high peaks. Animals began their preparations, and so did Clara and Gideon. "We're more prepared than we've ever been," Gideon said one evening, reviewing their supplies. "Prepared for normal winter," Clara said. "But what if it's not normal?" "What do you mean?" "Every old-timer I talked to in town said the signs point to a hard winter, early snow on the peaks, animals migrating earlier than usual, woolly caterpillars with extra thick coats." She looked at him. "I think we should prepare for worst case." They spent October in a frenzy of final preparations. Extra wood, extra food, extra supplies of everything they might need if they got cut off from town for extended periods. Clara insisted on stockpiling medical supplies, lamp oil, and feed for the animals. "You think I'm paranoid," she said when Gideon questioned the quantities. "I think you're cautious. There's a difference. My father always said hope for the best, but prepare for disaster. Disaster happens more often than best." The first snow fell on November 3rd. Not the light dusting that usually marked early winter, but 6 inches overnight, heavy and wet. "It's early," Gideon said, staring out at the transformed landscape. "It's a warning," Clara replied. "We need to bring the animals closer to the cabin, build better windbreaks, double-check everything." They worked frantically for 2 weeks, preparing for something neither could quite name but both felt coming. The storm hit on November 20th with a violence that shocked even Gideon, who'd lived through 16 Montana winters. The wind came first, howling down from the peaks with a sound like the mountain itself was screaming. Then the snow, so thick Gideon couldn't see the barn from the cabin door. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 2 hours. "We need to get the livestock inside the lower barn now," Clara shouted over the wind, "before this gets worse. It can't get much worse than this." It will. She was right. By nightfall, the storm had transformed from dangerous to catastrophic. Snow piled against the cabin walls faster than Gideon had ever seen. The wind tore shingles from the roof, and the temperature kept dropping until their breath froze in the air inside the cabin despite the roaring fire. "How much food do we have in the main stores?" Clara asked, already knowing the answer but needing confirmation. 6 weeks if we're careful. 8 if we ration hard. Not enough if this lasts. Clara moved to the window, but there was nothing to see except white. The Bradleys, they were low on supplies when I talked to Martha last week. They won't make it through extended winter. We can't control what happens in the valley. No, but we can control whether we help or we hide. Clara turned to face him. Your father built this place to be a fortress. We made it stronger. We have more than we need because we prepared. Meanwhile, people down there are going to freeze or starve because they didn't. Gideon knew where this was going. You want to help them. I want us to help them. There's a difference. It's a 3-hour ride to town in good weather. In this it's suicide, I know. Clara walked back to the table, started making calculations on paper. But if this storm breaks for even a day, we could get supplies down to the families most at risk. The Bradleys have 3 children. The Morgans just had a baby. The Hutchinsons have that grandfather living with them who can barely walk. You memorize the whole valley's situation? I pay attention to people. It's what you do when you've spent your life being invisible. She looked up from her notes. I'm not saying we save everyone. I'm saying we save who we can with what we have. Isn't that what capable people do? The storm raged for 3 days straight. On the 4th morning, Gideon woke to silence so profound it was almost frightening. He looked out to see 4 feet of snow blanketing everything, but the wind had died and weak sunlight struggled through thinning clouds. Clara was already awake, already dressed, already packing supplies. We have maybe 12 hours before the next wave hits, she said. I can feel it in my bones. We need to move fast. They loaded 2 horses with as much as the animals could carry. Preserved food, medical supplies, extra blankets, lamp oil. Gideon tried to argue that Clara should stay at the cabin where it was safe, but she shut him down with a look that could have frozen fire. You need someone to manage the supplies while you handle the heavy work. We go together, or we don't go at all. The ride down to the valley took 5 brutal hours. The horses struggled through snow that came up to their chests. Twice they had to dismount and lead the animals through drifts that would have buried them otherwise. Clara never complained, never suggested turning back, just kept pushing forward with the same stubborn determination she brought to everything. The valley looked like something from a nightmare. Houses were buried to their windows. Smoke rose from only half the chimneys, meaning the other half had either run out of wood or worse. They rode straight to the Bradley house and found Tom trying to dig a path to his barn. Vale? Tom dropped his shovel, staring like he'd seen ghosts. How did you... Nobody should be able to travel in this. We traveled anyway, Clara said, already dismounting. Where's Martha and the children? Inside. We're nearly out of firewood and down to our last supplies. Tom's voice cracked. I didn't know what we were going to do. Clara started unloading supplies. You're going to survive. That's what you're going to do. Where are the other families in worse shape? Tom stared at the food and blankets like they were miracles. The Morgans, they're in bad shape. Baby's been crying for 2 days straight. I think Helen's milk dried up from stress and malnutrition, and the Hutchinsons' grandfather collapsed yesterday. They don't have medicine. Gideon and Clara worked through the afternoon like a machine with 2 parts, hitting the families most at risk, distributing supplies with Clara's ruthless efficiency. She assessed each situation in minutes, allocated resources based on need rather than sentiment, and moved on before anyone could waste time with gratitude. At the Morgan house, she took one look at the exhausted mother and the screaming infant and immediately prepared a substitute feeding solution from supplies they'd brought. How did you know to bring this? Helen Morgan asked, tears streaming down her face as her baby finally quieted. I didn't know. I prepared for possibilities. Clara's voice was matter of fact. Feed her every 3 hours. If you run out before the storm breaks, send someone to our cabin. We have more. Old Mr. Hutchinson was in worse shape. Fever, labored breathing, skin gray with cold and illness. Clara examined him with hands that were surprisingly gentle despite their size. Pneumonia, she announced. Maybe bronchitis on top of it. He needs warmth, fluids, and these herbs steeped in hot water 3 times a day. She handed over a pouch. If he's not better in 4 days, the fever will probably take him. But this gives him a chance. The Hutchinson family looked at her like she'd descended from somewhere celestial. "Why are you helping us?" Mrs. Hutchinson asked. Some of us said unkind things about you when you first arrived." "I know what you said." "Everyone knows what everyone says in a valley this size." Clara stood, brushed snow from her coat. "But we're all trying to survive the same winter. Your words don't change that basic fact." They made it back to the cabin just as the second wave hit, another storm that sealed them in for 6 more days. During that time, Clara organized their remaining supplies, calculated exactly how long they could sustain themselves and still have reserves for emergency help, and planned for worst-case scenarios that made Gideon's careful preparations look optimistic. "You think differently than most people," he observed one evening. "I think like someone who's had to survive on their own most of their life," Clara replied. "When you can't rely on anyone else, you learn to see 3 moves ahead or you don't survive." "You're not alone anymore, though." She looked at him, something soft in her expression. "No, I'm not. Still getting used to that." The pattern repeated through December and into January. Storm would hit, trap everyone, break for a day or two, and Gideon and Clara would ride out with supplies. They became a lifeline for the valley, the only reason several families survived what was turning into the worst winter anyone could remember. And slowly, the mockery that had followed them turned into something else entirely. When they rode into town during a brief clear period in mid-January, people actually came out to greet them. Men offered to help unload their horses. Women insisted on sharing what little food they had. Children who'd once stared at Gideon with fear now waved at him like he was someone important. "Things have changed," Tom Bradley said, helping Gideon stack firewood. "People see what you two have done, what you keep doing. The whole valley would be in desperate shape without you." "We're just doing what needs doing," Gideon said. "No, you're doing what nobody else had the capability or courage to do." Tom paused. "I'm ashamed of what I thought when Clara first arrived. What I said to others. I was wrong. We were all wrong." But not everyone had changed their opinion. Gideon overheard 2 men talking near the general store, their voices carrying in the cold air. "They're just trying to buy goodwill," one said, "trying to make us forget what they are." "What they are is the reason your family isn't starving," another voice cut in sharply. Gideon recognized it as Henry Briggs, the postmaster. "Meanwhile, what are you, besides someone who talks big while others do the actual work?" The first man muttered something and walked away. When Gideon and Clara left town that afternoon, Henry caught up with them at the edge of the settlement. "Wanted to say something before you go," Henry said. "About your father." Gideon tensed. He rarely talked about his father with anyone. "Your father used to say a man's worth wasn't measured by how he looked or how smooth he talked. It was measured by what he did when things got hard." Henry looked between them. "He'd be proud of what you've built up there. Both of you." Clara nodded acknowledgement, but Gideon couldn't speak past the tightness in his throat. They rode back to their mountain in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind shared by people who understood each other without needing words. February brought a brief respite from the storms, and Clara used the time to organize something that surprised Gideon with its ambition. "We're setting up a central distribution point," she announced one morning, "at our cabin." "What?" "Think about it. We're positioned higher than everyone else, which means we can see weather coming before it hits the valley. We have storage capacity they don't, and we've proven we can get through when others can't." She was already sketching plans. "We convince families to pool their remaining resources here. Then when the next wave hits, we manage distribution based on actual need instead of panic. People won't want to give up control of their supplies. People will do what makes sense if you explain it properly." Clara looked at him. "We're not asking them to trust us from kindness. We're asking them to trust us from proven capability. There's a difference." It took 2 weeks of hard arguing, but Clara's logic proved irrefutable. By early March, they'd established what Clara called the Mountain Depot. 8 families had contributed to a shared emergency supply stored in Gideon and Clara's expanded storage facilities. In exchange, Clara maintained detailed records of who contributed what, and she managed distribution with absolute fairness when need arose. "You're running a business," Gideon observed, watching her update inventory records. "I'm running a survival cooperative," Clara corrected. "There's no profit, just the basic exchange of capability for security." "You're good at this." "I'm good at seeing what needs doing and doing it without waiting for permission." She set down her pencil. "My whole life, people told me I was too much, too big, too loud, too direct, too unfeminine. But up here, too much is exactly enough. Everything that made me wrong down there makes me right up here." Gideon walked to where she sat, tilted her chin up to look at him. "You were never wrong. They were just too small to see it." She kissed him then, and it still surprised him every time. The fact that someone chose him, wanted him, loved him exactly as he was. The storms continued through March, but they'd established a system that worked. When weather broke, families sent representatives to the mountain depot for supplies. Clara maintained her ruthless records, ensuring everyone contributed what they could and received what they needed. Gideon handled the heavy work, cutting extra timber, managing the livestock they'd started boarding for families who couldn't keep their animals fed, repairing equipment that broke under winter's assault. One afternoon in late March, Martha Bradley arrived with her 3 children in tow, struggling through snow that was finally starting to melt in places. "I need to talk to you both," Martha said, and something in her voice made Clara immediately pour coffee and sit her down. The children, 2 boys and a girl, ranging from 4 to 9, stared at Gideon with open fascination rather than fear. The youngest, a girl named Emma, walked right up to him. "Are you a giant?" she asked. "Emma," Martha gasped. "That's rude." "It's all right," Gideon said, surprised by his own reaction. A year ago, a child's question would have sent him retreating into silence. Now he just smiled, the expression still pulled wrong by his scar, but genuine. "I'm just very tall." "Why's your face like that?" "Bear got me a long time ago." "Did you get the bear back?" "I did." "Good." Emma nodded, satisfied, and went back to her brothers. Martha waited until the children were distracted before speaking quietly. "We're out of everything. Tom's been trying to hunt, but game is scarce and he's not skilled enough to find what's left. I contributed the last of our stores to the depot 2 weeks ago, but now we've got nothing in reserve." Her voice shook. "I know I've been taking more than we contributed. I know the numbers don't balance. But my children—" "Oh, stop," Clara said firmly. "You think I don't account for children in my calculations? You think I'd let kids go hungry because their father can't hunt well? But the records show what everyone can see. What they don't show is the separate accounting I maintain for families with young children." Clara pulled out a second ledger Gideon had never seen. "You're not taking more than you've contributed. You're taking what your family needs, which is what this entire system is designed to provide." Martha burst into tears. Clara let her cry for exactly 30 seconds before handing her a handkerchief. "Pull yourself together. Your children are watching." Clara's voice was gentle but firm. "Here's what's going to happen. You're taking home a week's supplies for a family of 5. Tom's going to come up here tomorrow, and I'm going to teach him how to hunt properly, because a man with 3 children should know how to feed them. And you're going to stop apologizing for needing help. That's what community means." After Martha left, Gideon looked at Clara with new understanding. "You've been managing 2 sets of books this whole time." "Of course I have. People need to believe the system is fair, which it is, but they also need to not worry about every family's private circumstances becoming public knowledge." Clara closed the hidden ledger. "The Morgans contributed almost nothing because they had nothing to contribute. The Hutchinsons gave more than they should have because the grandfather insisted on paying what he called his way. I balance it so everyone gets what they need without anyone's pride getting damaged. That's complicated. Being human is complicated. Managing humans is more complicated still." She looked at him. "But it works. Everyone survives with their dignity intact. That matters." April arrived with the first real signs of spring. Snow began melting in earnest, revealing damage from the winter's assault. Several buildings in the valley had collapsed under snow weight. Fences were destroyed. Livestock losses were significant, but no people had died. Not one. The valley gathered at the Bradley house in mid-April, the first time everyone had been able to meet since November. 37 people crammed into a space meant for maybe 20, and the topic was survival assessment and summer planning. Tom Bradley stood to speak. We need to acknowledge what got us through. This winter should have killed half of us. It didn't because two people saw it coming, prepared beyond what anyone thought necessary, and then shared those preparations without asking anything in return. We asked for contribution to the depot, Clara corrected from where she and Gideon stood near the back. That's not nothing. You asked for what people could afford and then made sure everyone got what they needed regardless of what they could afford, Tom replied. Don't pretend there's no difference between what you did and basic fairness. What you did was leadership. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. An older man named Samuel Koch stood. I've lived in this valley 40 years. I've seen hard winters before. This was something else entirely. And I'll be honest, when Clara first arrived, I said unkind things, called you both names I'm ashamed of now. We know what you said, Clara replied. Everyone knows what everyone said. I'm trying to apologize. Apology noted. Now let's talk about rebuilding instead of dwelling on words that don't matter anymore. But Samuel wasn't finished. They matter because I need to say them out loud. I was wrong. We were wrong. We judged you for being different instead of seeing you for being capable. We mocked what we should have respected. He looked around the room. I propose we establish the Mountain Depot as a permanent installation. Winter, summer, year-round. Managed by people who've proven they know what they're doing. Several people spoke at once, some agreeing, some questioning details. Clara raised her hand and the room quieted instantly. If we do this, it's done properly. Written agreements, fair contribution requirements, no favoritism, and if someone can't contribute goods, they contribute labor. Nobody gets a free ride, but nobody gets left behind either. Agreed, Tom said. All in favor? Every hand went up except Gideon's and Clara's. You two need to vote, Martha Bradley pointed out. We don't vote on things we're managing, Clara said. Conflict of interest. Then you accept the role? Clara looked at Gideon. He nodded slightly. We accept, she said, but understand what you're asking. We'll make decisions some of you won't like. We'll prioritize need over want, and we'll expect everyone to pull their weight according to their capability. That's exactly what we're asking for, Samuel said. The meeting continued for 2 more hours, establishing rules, contribution schedules, and protocols for the permanent depot. By the end, they'd created something unprecedented in the valley, a cooperative managed by competence rather than popularity or social standing. As people filed out, several stopped to thank Gideon and Clara personally. The children, no longer afraid of Gideon's appearance, actually hugged his legs before their parents could stop them. Emma Bradley looked up at him with complete seriousness. When I grow up, I want to be big like you and Miss Clara, so I can help people too. After everyone left, Gideon and Clara rode back to their mountain in the fading light. The valley below showed the first greens of spring emerging through melting snow. Smoke rose from every chimney now, not just half of them, life persisting despite winter's best efforts to crush it. We did something, Gideon said quietly. We did what needed doing, Clara corrected. There's a difference. Is there? Feels like the same thing to me. Clara was quiet for a moment. A year ago, I was alone in Iowa, convinced I'd always be alone because I didn't fit anywhere. You were alone on this mountain, convinced the same thing. Now we're here, and an entire valley survived because 2 people who didn't fit anywhere else fit perfectly together. The world didn't want us, Gideon said. The world doesn't know what it wants. Clara looked at him. But this mountain does. This valley does. And I do. They reached the cabin as the sun touched the western peaks. The expansion they'd built stood solid against the sky. The storage buildings held resources that would support not just them, but an entire community. The root cellar Clara had insisted on was proving its worth every day. But more than the buildings and supplies, what struck Gideon was the simple fact that he was no longer alone. That Clara stood beside him not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she'd chosen this place, this life. Him. I need to tell you something, he said as they unsaddled the horses. All right. I was going to give up before you wrote. I'd convinced myself that loneliness was just going to be my life, and I needed to accept it. He paused. You saved me from that. Clara set down the saddle she'd been carrying. We saved each other. That's what partnership means. She walked to him, placed her hands on either side of his scarred face. I was disappearing in Iowa, becoming smaller every year, trying to fit into a world that had no space for me. You gave me a place where being exactly who I am wasn't just accepted. It was necessary. I love you, Gideon said. The words felt foreign in his mouth, rusty from disuse, but true. I know, Clara replied. I've known for months, but I'm glad you finally said it. She kissed him. I love you too. Even though you cook terrible coffee and sometimes you're too stubborn for your own good. They stood together in the gathering darkness, two people the world had written off, now holding each other on a mountain that had become their kingdom. Spring turned into summer with work that never seemed to end, but also never felt overwhelming because they did it together. They expanded the depot, formalized the cooperative agreements, and started planning for the next winter with the same ruthless preparation that had saved the valley. But on a brutally hot day in early August, when the valley shimmered under heat that made winter seem like a distant dream, someone rode up to the cabin with news that would test everything they'd built. Fire! Tom Bradley gasped, his horse lathered from hard riding. Lightning strike on the western ridge. It's spreading fast, and the wind's pushing it straight toward the valley. Gideon and Clara exchanged one look and moved as a unit, already planning, already preparing for the fight that would determine whether the valley they'd saved from winter would survive the summer. Clara was already grabbing tools before Tom finished speaking. How far has it spread? Maybe 2 miles of ridge when I left, but the wind... Tom wiped sweat from his face that had nothing to do with the heat. It's pushing flames faster than a man can run. Gideon moved to the window, looked west. Even from here he could see the smoke rising in a dark column that stained the sky. If it jumps the ridge and gets into the valley timber, everything burns. Every building, every field, everything we saved through winter. Then we stop it before it jumps, Clara said flatly. She was already strapping on her work belt, loading it with tools. How many men in the valley? Maybe 15 capable of heavy work, Tom said. But most are talking about evacuation, packing up families and heading east toward the next valley. That's 3 days' travel with children in wagons, Clara said. The fire will catch them before they're halfway. Running is suicide. Fighting it might be suicide too, Tom replied. Samuel Koch says we should save what we can carry and abandon the rest. Gideon saw Clara's jaw tighten. Samuel Koch survived winter because we refused to abandon him. Now he wants to abandon everything at the first real test? It's fire, Clara, not snow. Can't organize fire, can't manage it with depot systems. No, but you can fight it with fire breaks if you're smart about positioning. She was already moving, gathering supplies. Gideon, we need every axe, every shovel, every tool we have. Tom, ride back and tell everyone to meet at the Western Pass in 2 hours. Anyone who can work. We're making our stand there. Clara, the men won't listen to... Oh, they'll listen or they'll watch everything burn. Their choice. She looked at Tom with eyes that allowed no argument. 2 hours. Western Pass. Bring everyone. After Tom left, Gideon caught Clara's arm. This is different from winter. We can control supplies, plan for cold, but fire follows wind and fuel. Control those and you control fire. She pulled down a map she'd drawn of the surrounding territory, pointed at the Western Pass. The ridge narrows here. If we create a fire break across this point before the flames arrive, we stop the spread into the valley. Fire hits the break, has nowhere to go, burns itself out. That's maybe 300 yards of dense timber we'd have to clear in, Gideon calculated quickly, 4 hours if we're lucky, with 15 men who've never done coordinated work like this. Then we better be lucky. Clara started loading tools onto their pack horse, because the alternative is watching an entire valley burn because people chose panic over planning. They rode hard for the Western Pass, and with every mile the smoke grew thicker. By the time they arrived at the narrow point where ridge met valley, ash was already falling like gray snow. The heat pressed against them even though the flames were still distant, and the wind howled with a sound like something alive and hungry. The valley men arrived in scattered groups over the next hour. Gideon counted 12, not 15. Some brought tools. Most brought fear. Samuel Koch was among them, older but still strong, and he spoke what most were thinking. This is madness. We should be evacuating, not standing here waiting to die. You'll die faster running than fighting, Clara said. her voice cutting through the nervous murmurs. "The fire's moving at maybe 5 miles per hour with this wind. You've got families, wagons, livestock. You'll make 2 miles per hour if you're lucky. Fire catches you in open country with nowhere to shelter." "And fighting it here is better?" "Fighting doesn't guarantee death." Clara pointed at the ridge. "The fire has to pass through this narrow section. We cut a fire break here, wide enough that flames can't jump it. And we stop everything before it reaches the valley." A younger man named Peter spoke up. "We don't know how to fight fires. We're farmers, not—" "You're people who can swing an axe and dig a trench," Clara interrupted. "That's all this requires, capability and refusal to quit." "Easy for you to say," Samuel muttered. "You don't have children in the valley waiting." Gideon stepped forward, and his size alone made several men step back. "You survived winter because we prepared for disaster and refused to panic when it hit. This is the same. Different threat, same response. We work together or we die separately." Tom Bradley moved to stand beside Gideon and Clara. "I'm staying. My family's in the valley. I'd rather die trying to save them than die running and failing anyway." One by one, the other men made their decision. Not all of them. 3 rode back toward the valley, choosing evacuation over the fight. But 9 stayed, and Clara immediately organized them with the efficiency she'd brought to depot management. "Gideon, take 4 men and start felling trees on the south side. Create a clearing 50 feet wide minimum. Peter, you and 3 others start digging a trench along the north side. 3 feet deep. Use the dirt to create a barrier. Tom, you're with me. We're going to burn a controlled strip ahead of the main fire." "Burn?" Tom's voice cracked. "We're trying to stop fire, not start more. We burn the fuel between here and the main fire. When the wildfire arrives, there's nothing left to burn, so it stops." Clara was already preparing torches. "It's called a backburn. Done right, it saves everything. Done wrong, it kills us all. So we're going to do it right." The work began with organized chaos. Gideon swung his axe with the rhythm of 16 years of practice, dropping trees that other men limbed and dragged clear. Sweat poured off everyone despite the heat already being unbearable. Ash clogged throats and burned eyes. The roar of approaching fire grew steadily louder, a sound like continuous thunder rolling across the mountain. Clara moved between groups, directing, correcting, pushing men past the point where they wanted to quit. When one man dropped his shovel and said he couldn't continue, she picked it up and handed it back. "Your farm's 3 miles that direction. Your wife and daughters are there. You can dig or you can watch them burn. Choose." The man took the shovel and kept digging. 2 hours in, they'd cleared maybe 100 yards. The main fire was visible now, a wall of orange and red that consumed everything in its path. Trees exploded from the heat, sending burning debris into the air. The wind intensified, carrying embers that started spot fires around them. "We're not going to make it," Peter gasped, beating out a small fire that had started in the dry grass. "It's moving too fast." "Then we work faster," Clara said, but even Gideon could hear the edge of desperation in her voice. They had maybe 90 minutes before the fire reached them, and they'd cleared less than half the necessary distance. The math was brutal and undeniable. They weren't going to finish in time. Gideon pulled Clara aside. "We need to start the backburn now. Even though we're not ready, it's the only chance. If we start it now and it jumps the break we haven't finished clearing, we trap ourselves between 2 fires. If we wait until the break is finished, the main fire will be here before we can light the backburn." Gideon looked at the approaching flames. "We're out of good options. This is the least bad one." Clara closed her eyes for just a moment, calculating odds she didn't like. "All right, but we divide the group. Half keeps working on the break. Half manages the backburn. If this goes wrong—" "It won't go wrong because you won't let it." Gideon squeezed her shoulder. "You've never failed at anything you've decided to do. Don't start now." She looked at him with something raw in her expression. "If we die here, we won't. But if we do, at least we die together instead of alone." He kissed her, tasting smoke and ash. "Now let's save this valley." Clara organized the backburn with the same precision she brought to everything. She had Tom and 3 others light controlled fires along a line 50 yards ahead of their incomplete break, then managed the burn to ensure it moved away from them toward the main fire. The backburn created its own hellish landscape. Walls of flame on both sides now, heat so intense it was hard to breathe. Gideon kept his team working on the break, even as burning debris fell around them, even as the smoke became so thick he could barely see the man next to him. "Keep moving," he shouted over the roar. "Don't stop." A massive pine came down wrong, pinning one of the workers beneath its trunk. The man screamed, and Gideon was there instantly, lifting the trunk with strength born from desperation. Two other men dragged their companion free, broken leg, but alive. "Get him back to the valley," Gideon commanded. "We need every man here," the injured man gasped. "You're no good to us, injured. Go!" As the man was helped away, Gideon returned to the work, muscles screaming, lungs burning, but refusing to stop because stopping meant dying. Clara's backburn was working, barely. The controlled fire consumed the fuel between them and the main blaze, creating a scorched barrier. But the wind kept shifting, pushing flames in unpredictable directions. She moved along the line with a wet blanket, beating out spot fires before they could spread, directing her team with shouts that barely carried over the fire's roar. Then the wind shifted hard to the south, pushing the backburn directly toward where Gideon's team was still working. "Clear out!" Clara screamed. "Move north now!" The men scrambled, grabbing tools, running through smoke so thick they were navigating by instinct. Gideon made sure every man was moving before following, counting heads, making sure no one was left behind. They'd almost made it clear when part of the ridge collapsed. The drought-weakened earth, destabilized by heat and fire, simply gave way. A section of ground maybe 20 feet across dropped into a ravine below, and Gideon, who'd been at the rear ensuring everyone else escaped, went down with it. He hit hard, felt ribs crack, slid through burning debris and over rocks that tore skin. The world became a chaos of pain and heat, and the certain knowledge that he was about to die. Above him, he heard Clara screaming his name. He tried to respond, but smoke filled his lungs and no sound came out. Burning timber had fallen across his legs, pinning him. He tried to move it, but the angle was wrong. His position was wrong. Everything was wrong. This is how it ends, he thought with strange clarity. After everything, after finding someone who made life worth living, death finds me anyway. Then Clara appeared through the smoke like something conjured from determination itself. "No," she said, the single word carrying absolute refusal. "You don't get to die on me." "Clara, get out! The fire!" She ignored him completely, grabbing the burning timber pinning his legs. The heat should have made it impossible to touch. She lifted it anyway, her face twisted with effort and pain, her hands blistering even through the gloves she wore. "Can you move?" she demanded. Gideon tried. His left leg wouldn't respond right, broken or badly damaged. "Can't stand." "Then I'm carrying you." "You can't. I'm too—" Claire got her arms under his shoulders and lifted. She actually lifted him, all 6'7" and 240 pounds of him, through sheer stubborn refusal to accept limitation. She half carried, half dragged him through flames that reached for them like living things. The smoke was so thick Gideon couldn't see anything, couldn't breathe, couldn't help. He felt Clara stumble, heard her grunt with effort, but she never stopped moving. They emerged from the worst of it into an area where the backburn had already consumed everything flammable. Clara lowered him to the ground, her hands raw and bleeding, her face blackened with soot and ash. "You stupid, stubborn man," she gasped. "You were supposed to leave first. Had to make sure everyone else—" "I know. That's why you're stupid." She was checking his injuries with hands that shook. Broken ribs. Definitely a broken leg. Probably internal bleeding. "You're a mess. But alive. For now." She looked back at the fire which had reached their incomplete fire break. For a moment, Gideon thought all their work had been for nothing. Then the fire hit the section where backburn and firebreak met, and there was simply nothing left to burn. The flames reached, found no fuel, and began to die. On the northern edge, where they hadn't finished the break, spot fires continued trying to spread, but Tom Bradley's team was there, beating them out one by one. Slowly, impossibly, the fire began to lose. Clara watched it happen with Gideon's head in her lap, her ruined hands pressing against his broken ribs trying to stabilize the damage. "We did it," she said, and her voice broke on the words. "We actually did it." Tom appeared through the smoke, his face a mask of soot and exhaustion. "The valley's safe. The fire's stopping at the break." He looked at Gideon. "How bad?" "Bad enough that he's not walking home," Clara said. "We need to rig a transport." They fashioned a stretcher from pine branches and the blankets they'd brought to fight spot fires. Loading Gideon onto it sent waves of agony through his broken body, but he bit down on the pain and said nothing. The trip back to the valley took 3 hours of careful movement. By the time they arrived, the entire community had gathered, having watched the smoke and flames from a distance, not knowing if their defenders would return. When they saw the fire crew emerge from the smoke, alive and successful, something shifted in the valley's collective understanding of what was possible. Martha Bradley ran to her husband, children trailing behind. "The fire?" "Stopped," Tom said, his voice hoarse from smoke. Clara figured out where to make the stand. Gideon held the line when it should have broken. "We're safe." The crowd pressed forward, everyone talking at once, asking questions, offering help. But Gideon barely registered it. Pain and smoke inhalation had pushed him to the edge of consciousness. He was only dimly aware of being carried to someone's house, of Clara refusing to leave his side, of a traveling doctor being summoned from 2 valleys over. When he woke, it was dark and he was in a bed he didn't recognize. Clara sat beside him, her hands wrapped in bandages, her face drawn with exhaustion but alert. "How long?" he managed to ask. 2 days. Doctor said your leg was broken in 3 places, ribs cracked, lungs damaged from smoke. You should have died in that ravine. Probably would have if you hadn't. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. "Don't move, you idiot." But her voice was gentle. "The valley's safe. The fire burned itself out against our firebreak exactly like it was supposed to. A couple of outlying sheds were lost to spot fires, but no homes, no people." "Your hands." Clara looked at her bandaged hands like she'd forgotten about them. "Second-degree burns from lifting that burning timber off you. Doctor says they'll heal, but I'll have scars." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I'd do it again." She leaned forward carefully. "You scared me, Gideon. I thought I'd finally found someone worth keeping, and the mountain was going to take you anyway." "The mountain didn't take me because you wouldn't let it." "Damn right I wouldn't." She brushed hair from his forehead with bandaged fingers. "We're not done yet. Still have a depot to run, a valley to manage, and about 30 years of life I plan to live with you." Over the following week, as Gideon healed enough to move around with crutches, he learned what had happened while he was unconscious. The valley had gathered the day after the fire, and the conversation had been transformative. Samuel Koch had stood and publicly apologized. "I wanted to run. I thought fighting was suicide. I was wrong. Clara saw what needed doing, and Gideon made sure it got done. They saved us again." Others had shared similar sentiments. The couple that had arrived as rejects, that the valley had mocked and dismissed, had now twice proven themselves more capable than those who judged them. But more than gratitude, something else emerged from the fire's aftermath. Respect. Not the grudging acknowledgement that had followed winter, but genuine recognition that Gideon and Clara possessed something the valley desperately needed. The ability to see what was coming, prepare for it, and lead others through it without panic. "They want to make it official," Tom Bradley explained when he visited Gideon on the 5th day. "The depot management, the emergency response, all of it. They want you and Clara formally recognized as Valley coordinators." "What does that mean?" Gideon asked. "Means when crisis comes, everyone agrees to follow your lead without argument. Means your decisions carry weight beyond your own property. Means," Tom paused, "means the Valley finally recognizes what should have been obvious from the start. You two aren't outsiders hiding here. You're the reason this place survives." Clara, who'd been listening from the doorway, walked in. "We don't need titles." "Maybe not, but we need the structure," Tom countered. "Winter proved we need coordinated response. The fire proved we need decisive leadership. We're trying to formalize what already exists. And if we make decisions people don't like, then we trust that you're making them for the right reasons." Tom stood. "The vote's in 3 days when Gideon can attend, but I can tell you now it'll be unanimous. The Valley knows what it owes you." After Tom left, Clara sat on the edge of Gideon's bed. "This isn't what I expected when I wrote that letter." "What did you expect?" "A cabin, a partner, maybe some peace." She looked at him. "Instead, we ended up building something bigger than both of us." "You want to say no to this?" Clara considered for a long moment. "No, because they're right. Without coordination, Without someone willing to make hard decisions, the next disaster will kill people. And she paused. I can't watch that happen when I know we could prevent it. We, Gideon repeated. We, Clara confirmed. Always we. I don't do this without you. The valley meeting happened on a clear August evening, the western ridge still showing scorch marks from the fire, but the valley itself untouched and green. Gideon attended on crutches, his legs still healing but functional enough for him to stand when needed. The vote was indeed unanimous. Gideon Vale and Clara Whitmore were formally recognized as the valley's emergency coordinators, responsible for disaster preparation and response. The depot would continue operating year-round, with expanded storage and increased community contribution requirements. But the more significant change was invisible, something that couldn't be voted on or formalized in agreements. The valley's understanding of worth had shifted. The criteria that had once defined value, appearance, social polish, conventional respectability, had proven catastrophically inadequate when tested by real challenges. What mattered, the valley had learned through snow and fire, was capability, determination, the willingness to work past exhaustion and refuse to quit when quitting would be easier. And by those measures, the two people the world had rejected were more valuable than everyone else combined. Emma Bradley approached Gideon after the meeting, looking up at him with the fearless directness of a child who'd never been taught to be afraid of difference. My mama says you and Miss Clara are heroes, she said. We're just people who did what needed doing, Gideon replied. That's what heroes are, though. Emma considered this with the seriousness only children achieve. People who do hard things when everyone else is scared. After the crowd dispersed, Gideon and Clara stood together, looking out at the valley they'd saved twice now. The settlement below showed lights in every window, smoke rising from every chimney, life continuing because two people had refused to let disaster win. Your leg's hurting, Clara observed. It is. You should be resting. Probably. But you wanted to see this. It wasn't a question. Yeah. Gideon looked at her, at this woman who'd charged into fire to save him, who'd carried him out when he couldn't walk, who'd chosen him when the world said he wasn't worth choosing. I wanted to see what we built. Clara took his hand, her bandaged one, still healing from burns she'd gotten saving his life. It's bigger than I expected. Good, bigger, or bad bigger? Just bigger. She squeezed his hand gently. A year ago, I was invisible in Iowa. You were alone on this mountain. Now we're standing here having saved 37 lives twice over, and a whole valley has decided we're worth following. Any regrets? About you? Never. Clara looked at him directly. About the responsibility we just accepted? Ask me in 10 years. They stood together as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors that matched the fire they'd fought. The valley below settled into evening routines, families gathering for dinner, children being called inside, livestock secured for the night. All of it continuing because two people the world called too much had proven to be exactly enough. Gideon's leg throbbed with pain that would probably never fully leave. Clara's hands would carry scars from burns that hadn't quite healed. Both of them were exhausted in ways that sleep wouldn't fix, but they were alive. They were together. And they'd built something that mattered. The mountain wind picked up, carrying the smell of scorched earth from the western ridge, a reminder of how close disaster had come. But it also carried the smell of pine and wildflowers, of earth recovering, of life persisting. Clara leaned against Gideon's solid frame, careful of his injuries. Let's go home. The valley will be fine for one night. She looked up at him. We did what needed doing, now we get to rest. They made their slow way back to their cabin, Gideon on crutches, Clara walking beside him in case he stumbled. The path they'd ridden so many times was familiar now, worn by their passage, marked by their presence. The cabin stood solid against the darkening sky, windows glowing with lamplight Clara had left burning. Smoke rose from the chimney where she'd banked the fire that morning. The expansion they'd built together showed the fruits of their combined labor, storage full of supplies, structures built to last, a home made for two people who'd finally found where they belonged. Inside, Clara helped Gideon into the chair by the fireplace before starting preparations for dinner. Her movements were efficient despite her bandaged hands, practiced from months of working in this space. You don't have to cook, Gideon said. I can manage something. Your version of managing something is boiling meat until it's inedible. Clara pulled out ingredients for stew, always stew, because some things became tradition through repetition. I'll cook, you rest. That's the current division of labor. Gideon watched her work, memorizing the way lamplight caught her hair, the set of her shoulders, the competent grace in her movements despite injuries and exhaustion. A year ago, this cabin had been a tomb for the living. Now, it was something else entirely. Clara seemed to sense his attention. What? Just thinking. About? About how the world tried to convince us we weren't enough, and how completely wrong the world was. Clara turned from the stove, wooden spoon still in hand. The world's wrong about a lot of things. We just happen to be right about each other. She returned to cooking, and Gideon sat in comfortable silence, letting the pain in his leg fade into background noise against the larger reality of being alive, being home, and being exactly where he belonged. The stew that evening tasted different somehow, though Clara used the same ingredients she always did. Maybe it was the smoke still lingering in their lungs, giving everything a charred edge, or maybe it was just the sharp awareness that comes from nearly dying, the way food tastes more real when you've been reminded you won't eat forever. Your hands, Gideon said, watching Clara struggle to grip her spoon properly through the bandages. Will heal. You didn't have to grab that timber, could have lost your hands entirely. Clara set down her spoon and looked at him with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and affection. What exactly did you think I was going to do? Leave you there to burn because it might hurt my hands? Most people would have. Then most people are idiots. She picked up her spoon again with obvious difficulty. Besides, hands heal. You don't. At least not if you're dead. They finished eating in silence, and Gideon realized this was what the other brides had never understood. Love wasn't the absence of difficulty. It was the willingness to walk through difficulty together and come out the other side changed but intact. Margaret had wanted comfort. Catherine had wanted conversation. Sarah had wanted entertainment. Rachel had wanted escape from loneliness without the work that made partnership possible. Clara wanted something else entirely. She wanted reality, raw and difficult and honest. She wanted a partner who could handle her being exactly who she was, and she offered the same in return. That night, lying in bed with Gideon's broken leg propped on pillows and Clara's bandaged hands resting carefully on her stomach, they talked about the future in ways they hadn't before. We should expand this depot again, Clara said to the darkness. Winter proved we need more storage. The fire proved we need better fire suppression equipment. And if we're officially coordinating emergency response, we need proper facilities. That's a year's worth of construction. Good thing we're not afraid of work. She shifted carefully, mindful of his injuries. But there's something else we need to talk about. Gideon waited. Children, Clara said quietly. I'm 38. You're 42. If we're going to have them, we can't wait much longer. The statement hung in the air between them. Gideon had spent so many years convinced he'd die alone that he'd stopped thinking about legacy beyond the mountain itself. You want children? He asked. I want a family. Whether that's children we have or children we help raise in this valley, I haven't decided yet. Clara turned to look at him in the dim light. But I need to know what you want. Actually want, not just what you think I want to hear. Gideon took time with his answer because Clara deserved truth, not comfort. I never let myself want it before. Seemed cruel to imagine children when no woman would stay long enough to build that life with me. But now, he paused. Yeah, I want it. Want to see what we'd create together beyond buildings and depot systems. It won't be easy, Clara said. I'm not young. Pregnancy at my age carries risks, and raising children up here isolated from other kids most of the time. The valley has children now. Emma Bradley, the Morgan baby, the Hutchinson grandchildren who visit every summer. It's not like it was when I was growing up alone up here. True, Clara was quiet for a moment. All right then, we try, but we don't force it. If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, we build family other ways. Agreed. They fell asleep holding hands carefully around bandages and injuries, and Gideon thought about how strange it was that the most honest conversations often happened in darkness, when you couldn't see the other person's face and had to trust their words alone. Gideon's leg took 3 months to heal properly. and even then it ached in cold weather, a permanent reminder of the day the mountain tried to take him, and Clara refused to let it. During those months, the valley underwent its own transformation. The depot expanded significantly. Tom Bradley led the construction effort, and a dozen men who'd once mocked Gideon's appearance now worked beside him with genuine respect. They built additional storage buildings, established a dedicated fire response cache with equipment purchased collectively, and created a meeting hall where valley decisions could be made communally rather than in someone's cramped house. Clara managed everything with the same ruthless efficiency she brought to winter preparation, but Gideon noticed something softening in her too. She spent more time with the valley children, teaching them practical skills their parents often lacked. Emma Bradley became a constant presence at the cabin, following Clara around asking endless questions about cooking, preserving food, animal care, and why adults made so many stupid decisions. Because adults forget that being honest is easier than being polite, Clara told her one afternoon while showing her how to preserve berries. They learn to say what makes others comfortable instead of what's actually true. That's dumb, Emma said with the blunt assessment only children manage. Very dumb, Clara agreed. Try not to become that kind of adult. I won't. I'm going to be like you. Clara paused in her work, and Gideon saw something shift in her expression. What do you mean? Big and strong and not afraid to tell people when they're wrong. Emma said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Mama says you're the strongest person in the valley, not just your arms, your whole self. After Emma left that evening, Clara stood at the window for a long time, staring out at nothing in particular. You all right? Gideon asked. That child has no idea what she just gave me, Clara said quietly. What's that? Proof that being exactly who I am might actually matter to someone beyond just survival. She turned to look at him. I spent so many years convinced that my size, my directness, my refusal to be smaller, all of it was just tolerated at best, despised at worst. But Emma looks at me and sees someone worth becoming. Because you are worth becoming. Maybe, Clara moved away from the window, or maybe the valley just needed to be desperate enough to see value in things they'd normally reject. Does it matter why they see it as long as they do? Clara considered this. Ask me in another year. The valley's first organized harvest celebration happened in late September, a week-long event where families contributed food and labor to help bring in everyone's crops before the first frost. It was Clara's idea. Pooled labor was more efficient than individual struggle, and it built the community cooperation that emergencies required. Gideon watched her coordinate 30 people across 6 farms with the precision of a military campaign. She knew who worked best at what tasks, who needed supervision, and who could be trusted to work independently, which families had surpluses to share and which needed extra support. You're good at this, Tom Bradley observed, watching Clara redirect 3 men from a field that was already handled to one that was falling behind. I'm good at seeing what needs doing and making sure it gets done, Clara corrected. That's different from being good at people. Is it? Seems like the same thing to me. But Gideon knew what Clara meant. She managed systems brilliantly. But genuine connection, the kind that didn't serve a functional purpose, still came hard to her. She was learning, slowly, to accept that people might value her presence beyond her capability. But decades of rejection didn't erase themselves just because circumstances changed. One evening during Harvest Week, as they sat around a communal bonfire, Samuel Koch stood to make an announcement. We've been talking, those of us who've been in this valley longest, and we want to propose something. He looked uncomfortable, like a man about to admit he'd been wrong about something fundamental. This valley doesn't have a name. We've always just called it the valley or the territory. But that was when we were just scattered families trying to survive alone. He paused, looking around at the gathered faces. We're not that anymore. We're an actual community now, organized and functional. We survived winter and fire because we worked together under good leadership. So we're proposing this place be called Vale Valley, after the man whose father first homesteaded the ridge and whose son and his wife saved us all. The crowd erupted in agreement, but Gideon felt Clara's hand tighten on his. No, Clara said, standing. The crowd quieted instantly. She'd earned that kind of immediate attention. Vale Ridge, maybe. Vale Mountain, but not Vale Valley. Why not? Samuel asked, genuinely confused. Because this valley survived through collective effort, not individual heroism. Naming it after one family undermines that. Clara looked around at the gathered crowd. Every person here contributed something. Tom Bradley organized construction. Martha Bradley managed food distribution during the worst of winter. The Morgans shared their livestock expertise. The Hutchinsons provided shelter when the depot was full. Samuel Koch admitted when he was wrong and changed his position. That takes strength most people don't have. She paused. If you need to name this place, call it something that reflects what we built together. But don't hang it on two people who just did what anyone else would have done if they had the capability. But that's the point, Tom said quietly. Most of us didn't have the capability. You two did, and you used it to save everyone instead of just yourselves. That deserves recognition. Recognition and naming rights are different things. Clara sat back down. I don't need my name on a valley to know my life mattered. The fact that everyone here is alive is enough. The discussion continued late into the night, but ultimately they compromised. The valley would be called Clearwater Valley, after the creek that ran through it, but the ridge where Gideon and Clara's cabin stood would be known as Vale Ridge, a marker of contribution without the weight of ownership. You could have had the whole valley named after us, Gideon said later as they rode home under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Could have. Didn't want it. Clara looked up at the sky. My whole life, people either wanted to erase me or couldn't ignore me. Nobody just let me exist without making it mean something beyond what it actually meant. I'm not going to do that to myself just because circumstances changed. What does it actually mean then? That we found each other, that we built something good, that we helped people when they needed it. She looked at him. That's enough. It doesn't need to be more than that. Winter came again, but this time the valley was ready. The depot was fully stocked, families had contributed their required shares, and Clara's organizational systems ensured nobody would go hungry or freeze, regardless of how bad the weather got. The storms were harsh, but nothing like the previous year's catastrophe. The valley managed them with the practiced efficiency of people who'd learned from experience and had leadership that actually knew what it was doing. In February, Clara discovered she was pregnant. She told Gideon on a clear, cold morning when the sun turned the snow-covered landscape into something almost painfully beautiful. They were alone in the cabin, the valley quiet below them, the world reduced to just the two of them, and the news that would change everything. I'm terrified, she said bluntly. So am I. I'm too old for this. The risks, and I know the risks. Gideon pulled her close, careful and gentle, in ways he'd learned over their time together. But we're not doing this alone. We have a whole valley now. We have the doctor who settled here after the fire. We have Martha Bradley, who's raised 3 children. We have resources and support we didn't have before. What if I'm not good at this? Claire's voice was smaller than he'd ever heard it. I can manage depot systems and fight fires and organize communities, but an actual child, someone who'll need things I don't know how to give? Then we'll figure it out the same way we figured out everything else. Gideon placed his hand over her still flat stomach. Together, honestly, without pretending we know more than we do. That's a terrible parenting strategy. Probably, but it's our strategy and it's kept us alive this long. Clara laughed despite herself, and some of the fear left her expression. All right, we're doing this. We're doing this. The pregnancy was difficult. Clara, who'd never been sick a day in her life, spent the first 3 months exhausted and nauseated. She hated every minute of it, hated the weakness, hated having to accept help instead of providing it. This is unnatural, she muttered one morning, unable to keep breakfast down for the 3rd day in a row. Pretty sure it's the definition of natural, Gideon pointed out. Then nature is a cruel bastard and I want to register a complaint. But as the pregnancy progressed and her energy returned, something else happened. The valley women, who'd kept a polite distance from Clara before, respecting her but not quite knowing how to befriend someone so fundamentally different from themselves, began to include her in ways they hadn't previously. Martha Bradley brought her a cradle that had held her own 3 children. Helen Morgan shared advice about managing infant feeding. Even women Clara barely knew stopped by with gifts, stories, warnings, and the kind of casual intimacy that comes from shared experience. They're treating me like I'm one of them, Clara observed to Gideon one evening, surrounded by baby clothes and blankets the valley women had contributed. You are one of them. No, I mean, they're treating me like a normal woman. Not the woman who saved them, not the woman who runs the depot. Just another person having a baby. She looked at the pile of gifts. I didn't realize how much I needed that. The baby arrived in late September, a week before harvest celebration, and 2 weeks earlier than expected. The labor was brutal, 20 hours of Clara doing what she always did, which was endure without complaint until the job was finished. When the doctor finally placed the infant in her arms, Clara looked down at the squalling, red-faced creature with an expression Gideon had never seen on her face before. Something between terror and absolute determination. "It's a girl," the doctor announced unnecessarily. "Of course it is," Clara said. "Couldn't be anything else." They named her Ruth, after Clara's mother. She was healthy and loud, and from the very first hour made it clear she had inherited both her parents' stubbornness and their tendency to take up space unapologetically. The Valley celebrated Ruth's arrival like she belonged to everyone, which, in a way, she did. Emma Bradley appointed herself as Ruth's primary guardian, appearing at the cabin constantly to help with the baby, even though Ruth was far too young to need a 9-year-old's assistance. "She's going to be strong like you," Emma told Clara solemnly, watching Ruth grip her finger with surprising force. "And brave like Mr. Gideon." "Or she'll be completely herself," Clara replied. "Either way is fine." Watching Clara with Ruth over the following months, Gideon saw his wife discover capabilities he wasn't sure she knew she possessed. She brought the same intensity to motherhood that she brought to everything else, but tempered with a gentleness that surprised him. When Ruth cried in the middle of the night, Clara would pace the cabin floor, singing the same mining ballads she'd sung while working, her voice rough but soothing. When Ruth struggled to feed, Clara adjusted and adapted with the same problem-solving she applied to depot logistics. When Ruth was simply fussy for no reason, Clara held her and said, "I know everything's terrible and unfair, and you have opinions about it. You come by that honestly." One evening, when Ruth was about 4 months old, Gideon found Clara sitting on the porch with the baby, looking out at the valley below where lights were beginning to appear as families lit their evening lamps. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That 5 years ago I was alone in Iowa, convinced I'd always be alone because the world didn't have room for someone like me." Clara shifted Ruth to her other arm. "And now I'm sitting on a mountain ridge with a daughter and a husband and an entire valley that looks to us for leadership. Life doesn't make any sense sometimes." "Good sense or bad sense?" "Just sense." She looked at him. "The world didn't change, we just found the part of it that had room for what we are. That's different. Is it enough? The cabin, the valley, this life?" Claire considered the question seriously. "Remember when I first arrived and you asked what I wanted? I said I wanted to stop pretending to be smaller just to make others comfortable." "I remember. This is more than that. This is a place where being exactly who I am isn't just tolerated. It's necessary. Where your size and my stubbornness and our combined refusal to quit when things get hard is the difference between survival and disaster." She looked down at Ruth, who was falling asleep in her arms. "And now we're raising a daughter in a place where she'll never have to apologize for taking up space." "That's a yes, then." "That's a yes." The years that followed established patterns that became traditions. Winters remained hard but manageable through Clara's depot systems. Summers brought harvest celebrations that grew larger as word spread, and new families arrived, drawn by stories of the valley that had survived impossible odds. The mountain ridge where Gideon and Clara lived became known across Montana territory as a place where capability mattered more than appearance, where leadership was earned through action rather than inheritance or social standing. Ruth grew into a child who was indeed big like her parents and completely unashamed of it. At 5 years old, she was already helping Clara with depot inventory, learning to read and write by recording supply levels. She followed Gideon into the forest without fear, learning to identify trees and track animals and understand the mountain's rhythms. "She's going to be formidable," Martha Bradley observed one afternoon, watching Ruth organize a group of younger children into a work crew to stack firewood. "She already is," Clara said. "Question is whether the world will try to break that, or whether we can keep her strong enough to resist." "You kept yourself strong enough." "Barely, and it cost me 20 years of loneliness." Clara watched her daughter, who was now arguing with a boy twice her age about the correct way to stack logs. "I want her to have better than barely." "Then you teach her what you know," Martha said. "You show her that being too much for small spaces just means finding bigger spaces. That's what you did." More families arrived over the following years, drawn by the valley's reputation for effective community management and by stories of the couple on the ridge who'd built something rare, a place where what you could do mattered more than what you looked like or where you came from. Some came fleeing other places that hadn't accepted them. A Chinese family escaping exclusion laws and violence in mining camps. A black man who'd been a freed slave and couldn't find work anywhere that would pay fairly. A woman traveling alone with 2 children and no husband, which in most places was enough to make her unemployable and unwelcome. All of them found space in Clearwater Valley because Clara's depot system assessed contribution, not background, and because Gideon's quiet authority ensured that anyone who worked hard and dealt honestly was accepted regardless of what they'd left behind. "We're building something that shouldn't be possible," Tom Bradley said one evening as they surveyed the expanded settlement below. 23 families now, nearly 100 people total, all functioning with a level of cooperation most towns couldn't manage. "It's only impossible if you think people can't change their basic assumptions," Clara replied. "We just proved they can if the alternative is dying. It's more than that, though. The Valley doesn't just tolerate difference now, it values it. How did you manage that?" Clara thought about this. "We didn't manage it. We just made it impossible to ignore that the people they'd normally reject were the ones keeping everyone alive. Eventually, their own survival instinct overrode their prejudice. It's not noble. It's just practical." But Gideon, listening to this conversation, thought it was more than practicality. What they'd built was proof that humans could reorganize their understanding of worth when forced to confront the consequences of their previous judgments. The Valley had learned, slowly, painfully, but genuinely, that survival belonged to the capable, not the comfortable. And capability came in forms that conventional society missed because it was too busy judging surfaces. When Ruth turned 7, Clara started teaching her something beyond practical skills. They'd sit on the porch in the evenings, and Clara would talk about what it meant to be someone the world tried to make smaller. "People will tell you you're too much," Clara said one evening. "Too tall, too strong, too loud, too direct. They'll use too much like it's a criticism." "What do I say?" Ruth asked. "You say nothing. You just keep being exactly who you are, and you find spaces large enough to hold you." Clara pulled her daughter close. "This mountain, this valley, it's large enough. But you might find other places too. The point is you never make yourself smaller just to fit somewhere that's too small to begin with." "Did you make yourself smaller before you came here?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "I tried. For years, I tried. It never worked because I'm not built to be smaller. I'm built to be exactly this size, with exactly this much voice and strength and stubbornness. When I finally accepted that, I found your father and this place." "What if I'm different from you?" "Then you'll be different. But you'll still be too much for some spaces, because everyone is. The trick is knowing which spaces are worth fitting into and which ones you should just leave behind." Ruth absorbed this with the seriousness children bring to truths they sense are important. "I think I understand." "Good. Now go help your father with the evening chores. He's trying to fix the barn door again and pretending he doesn't need help." As Ruth ran off, Gideon emerged from the barn, proving Clara's assessment correct. "How'd you know I was struggling?" "Because I know you. You've been fighting with that door for 3 days rather than admit the hinges need complete replacement." "Replacement's expensive." "So is wasting time on repairs that won't hold." Clara stood, stretched. "We'll order new hinges on the next supply run. Meanwhile, stop being stubborn about asking for help when you need it." "That's rich coming from you." "I ask for help all the time now. I've evolved." But she was smiling. "Besides, that's what partnership means. You handle what I can't. I handle what you can't. Together we manage everything." They stood together watching the sun set, a ritual they'd maintained since Clara's first weeks on the mountain. The view hadn't changed much, same mountains, same valley below, same endless sky. But everything else had transformed completely. The cabin that once echoed with loneliness now overflowed with life. Ruth's belongings scattered everywhere. Clara's organized chaos of depot records and community management. Gideon's tools and projects in various states of completion. Signs of human occupation, human connection, human love in all its messy reality. The valley below showed growth too. What had been scattered, desperate homesteads was now a functional community with shared resources, collective decision-making, and leadership that actually worked. Not perfect, They still had arguments and disagreements and occasional failures of cooperation, but functional in ways most settlements never achieved. "Did you ever imagine this?" Gideon asked. "When you wrote that letter?" "I imagined not being alone anymore. I didn't imagine changing an entire valley's understanding of worth." Clara leaned against him. "That was just what happened when we refused to quit." "Think it'll last after we're gone?" "I think we've proved you can build something different if you're willing to challenge basic assumptions about who matters and why." Clara looked at the valley. "Whether it lasts depends on whether the next generation remembers why it worked. That's Ruth's problem to solve, not ours." Ruth, as if summoned by her name, appeared from the barn covered in dust and carrying a broken hinge. "Papa, this is completely rusted through. Why didn't you replace it before it broke?" "Because your father is stubborn," Clara called out. "That's not stubbornness, that's poor resource management," Ruth said seriously. "You taught me that preventive maintenance is cheaper than emergency replacement." Clara laughed. "I did teach you that. Good memory. So can we order new hinges?" "Yes, go wash up for dinner." After Ruth went inside, Gideon pulled Clara close. "She's going to be better than both of us." "She better be. That's the whole point of raising children. They should exceed their parents, not just replicate them." Clara kissed him. "Now let's go inside before she decides to reorganize the kitchen again. Last time she did that, I couldn't find anything for a week." The years continued their pattern. Winters managed, summers built, the valley growing stronger with each cycle. More families arrived. The depot expanded again. New systems emerged to handle increased complexity. And through it all, Gideon and Clara remained the steady center that everything else organized around. When Gideon turned 52 and Clara turned 49, the valley threw them a celebration they didn't want and couldn't refuse. Nearly 200 people gathered. The valley had quadrupled in size over the decade, and speaker after speaker talked about what the couple on Vale Ridge had meant to them. Tom Bradley spoke about the winter they survived. Samuel Koch spoke about the fire. Newer arrivals spoke about finding acceptance after rejection elsewhere. The Chinese family talked about building a life where their children weren't treated as foreign threats. The woman who'd arrived alone spoke about raising her children in a place that valued her capability over her marital status. Ruth, now 10 and already showing signs of becoming the force of nature her mother had predicted, spoke last. "Most people know my parents as the people who saved the valley twice and organized the depot and taught everyone how to work together," she said, standing on a chair so she could be seen. "But I know them as the people who taught me that being too much for small spaces just means you need to find bigger spaces." That's what they did. They found a space big enough to hold everything they were, and then they made sure that space was big enough for everyone else too. She looked directly at her parents. "I'm going to be big like them. Not just physically big, though probably that too, but big in the way that matters, refusing to be smaller, refusing to quit, refusing to accept that the world's first answer is the only answer. They taught me that, and I'm going to teach it to everyone else." The crowd erupted in approval, but Clara just wiped her eyes and looked at Gideon. "We made something that's going to outlast us," she said quietly. "We made something that matters," Gideon corrected. "Whether it lasts is someone else's problem." Later that night, after everyone had gone home, and Ruth had finally fallen asleep despite her protest that she wasn't tired, Gideon and Clara sat on their porch in the darkness, listening to the valley settle into night. "Do you have any regrets?" Clara asked. Gideon thought about the question seriously. "No, you?" "One." "What's that?" "That it took me so long to find this place, to find you. I wasted a lot of years trying to fit into spaces that were never going to hold me." She paused. "But I suppose the wasted years were what made me ready to recognize this when I found it. So maybe not even that's a real regret." "The world told us we weren't enough," Gideon said. "Every day in different ways, they told us we were too damaged, too big, too rough, too much to ever fit anywhere that mattered. And the world was wrong." "The world was wrong," Gideon agreed. "We weren't too much. We just needed a space large enough to hold everything we were. And when we couldn't find that space, we built it ourselves." Clara took his hand, her scarred hand from the fire, holding his scarred hand from a lifetime of mountain work. Two people marked by survival, by refusal to quit, by stubborn determination to matter despite a world that said they shouldn't. "I love you," Clara said, "not despite who you are or because I've learned to tolerate who you are. I love you because of exactly who you are. Every scarred, stubborn, silent piece of you. I love you the same way, Gideon replied. Every loud, strong, relentless piece of you. They sat together as the stars wheeled overhead and the valley they'd saved and built and protected settled into the peace that comes from good work honestly done. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. It always did. But they'd face them the same way they'd faced everything else. Together. Honestly. Without apology for being exactly who they were. The mountain wind picked up, carrying the smell of pine and wildflowers, and the future Ruth would build on the foundation they'd established. The cabin behind them stood solid, expanded and improved, but still recognizably the same structure Gideon's father had started decades ago. Some things changed, some things endured, and some things, like the simple truth that capability mattered more than appearance, that partnership required honesty over comfort, and that the world's first judgment was often completely wrong, those things became permanent. Not because anyone decreed it, but because two people had proved it with their lives, and an entire valley had learned from watching them refuse to quit when quitting would have been easier. That was enough. It had always been enough. And it would remain enough long after they were gone, proof etched into the mountain itself that sometimes the people the world rejects are exactly the people the world needs most. They just needed to find spaces large enough to show it.